incentive on an ego basis for these people to drop out? What's the actual incentive to get off the debate stage in 6 weeks?
I think a lot of them would like to be players for the next few years, have their own talk shows, things like that. But I'll make you guys a wager. The first major candidate to drop out will be Mike Pence. He had an awful night, no energy. I think Pence could be out by Thanksgiving. Okay, that's a fine prediction as well. Are all these people running for cabinet office? I mean, I don't get it. Is Scott of the Carolinas, is Scott running to be Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Treasury, whatever? Sure. And to be uncynical for a minute, I think they have a message. They have a message they want to discuss. Okay. Scott did on race last night, and I thought he was quite eloquent. So, no, they want to stick around for a while longer. But the key is going to be running out of money. Pence is almost out of money. I think others, have enough to get through the end of the year. But I think you'll see a lot of big contributors not giving much more money.
3 months ago, people would say, just wait, we don't really know what this race is going to be. It could be through somebody very different than the former President Trump and President Biden. Some people were talking about Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin as a possible interim. People were talking about California Governor Newsom coming into the sphere. Why do you say the train's leaving the station for anything other than a Biden-Trump matchup?
Oh, in a word or two, it's filing deadlines. A lot of states have filing deadlines by late October, early November. So I do think the train is leaving the station, both for Glenn Youngkin and for Gavin Newsom. I think they've got to wait for another 4 years.
What did you make, Greg, last night of, on the debate stage, the negative feelings toward a shutdown, the sort of antipathy toward some of the right-wingers in the Republican Party who are trying to shut down the government as soon as Saturday night?
Well, we're now entering one of the great Washington games, Lisa, and that is the blame game. Who gets blamed for this? And McCarthy, all of a sudden, in the last 24 hours, has decided to blame Biden, blame the Senate, blame the Democrats. He's trying to shift the blame to everyone, and that's going to be a big theme in the next few days.
Greg, just want to finish up on Nikki Haley. Once again, a lot of people think she did a tremendous job in that debate yesterday evening, based on the reviews that I've seen. If you look at the polls at a national level, taking on the current president, Joe Biden, she does tremendously well. Greg, what can she do at the primary level to make sure that she's it for next year?
I think you hit on it, John, and that is her argument is going to be she could win a general election, and I think she could do well. She is an outstanding debater, and I think she's going to be in this race for quite a while.
Greg, thank you, sir, for your view on things this morning. Thank you. Greg Valliere there of AGF Investment. Round 2 for GOP. Yeah. Certainly lacked the buzz at a previous debate, Tom. But based on the performance of Nikki Haley and the reviews that I've seen through this morning, based on the polls that you see at the national level, Greg put out the argument for her, I think, going forward.
The thing I detest, and I got one observation, John, to you that I think is important, but the thing I detest is where the sort of right TV does this litmus test voting thing where they'll bring up a topic and they want you on record to raise your hand. It cringe-inducing. It is. I have a question for you.
Sure.
He said something important there.
What was that?
These people run out of money. In the United Kingdom, in the beautiful, short, contained ballet you have, do people run out of money?
Short answer, it's not the same issue at all. The way elections are run, the way they're financed here is just completely different. Totally foreign to anyone that follows British elections.
But I mean, somebody, I'll pick York, and I don't know it. It's up north, it's York, it's a really important borough, whatever you call them. They don't run out of money, right?
Well, this leadership race would happen pretty quickly, Tom, in the UK.
Lisa, we are so flawed on this. I don't even know where to begin.
Well, what would change it? What would change it?
Senator McCain and others tried to change it, and they got crushed in court. That's a short answer. That they tried.
Honestly, I think that right now the most interesting takeaway is as much noise as we keep hearing, whether it's the shutdown, whether it's the political back and forth, whether it's the internecine arguments in both parties, the dollar still is preeminent. And I think that the bottom line is people still view the nation as the world's main economy. And so, you say all of these things, and yet here we are. It doesn't seem to have really jeopardized the nation's standing, which really is the question. At what point is there sort of like a vigilante kind of movement to force change? Because right now it ain't there.
I've said for a while you have the luxury here of being reckless. on certain issues.
It's probably true.
You do when it comes to shutdown and debt ceiling debates.
Yes, we do.
We know what the reaction is. It's buy treasuries. Whenever there's a problem, it's buy the US dollar. Did you see Governor Newsom in the spin room? I saw some of those clips. Speaking of Sean Hannity, again, those two should have a show, honestly. He was talking about crude production, energy independence in the United States. The GOP are coming after the energy story of the Democrats and this White House, the president. Yeah. Governor Newsom's making a point. Look at where energy is currently in America. Now, you can say it's because of this White House or despite it. Right. The fact of the matter is we've got crude production in America pushing 13 million barrels a day. Coming up shortly, Ian Shepherdson, chief economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. Your equity market totally unchanged on the S&P. A little bit of a snooze, and maybe that's welcome news.
For the first, call it 18 years at Chipotle, this was you come into Chipotle along the line, you interact with the crew, and you customize your meal. We've got this separate make line, and it's digitized, and so the orders come in, and they're really kind of staged so that if you say at noon, I want to come in at 1 o'clock, we hold that order, and we will send it to the crew like maybe 10 to 1,
right.
So it's ready right when you pull up your car.
How do you manage these kind of two different staffing needs, right?
Yes.
And making sure you have the right amount of people
yes.
at the right time.
We spend a lot of time projecting sales. A lot of it is, it's part art, part science. We're trying to bring more science and more AI into it. Because if you get the right sales projection, then you know exactly what your staffing needs to be. So if you get the sales right, you can get the entire restaurant staffed perfectly. With just a couple people, our average restaurant now does about over $1 million per restaurant in digital sales.
Our studios in New York and San Francisco. Our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch. Plus, the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action. 12 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 a.m. in the West. Only on Bloomberg Television, your global business authority.
Our next guest teeing up his own interview on X, Twitter, saying this. Talking macro, and I hope Newcastle United's glorious victory last night. Ian Shepherdson coming up shortly. We'll talk about Newcastle just for you, Ian. Let's start with the price action on the equity market. In the S&P 500 on the NASDAQ. We're positive just about on the S&P at the close as well yesterday. Decent rally into the end of the trading session. The NASDAQ also closing positive this morning, slightly negative by 0.1%. Headline after headline in the bond market. Let's get to it. 2-year, 10-year, 30-year. Here's your 10-year right now.
Wow.
464, 463.65. Here's your 30-year, 475. Yields are up by about 3 basis points. Tom, I remember hearing again and again and again repeatedly, particularly around the banking stress of spring, that was it. You've seen your cycle highs in this bond market. And here we are through those levels.
On a nominal basis, there they are. There are 3 numbers lined up, but what matters is the comparison and the dynamics. John, we have further curves of disinversion. This morning, we've gone from negative 100 pre-Misra. Think of that base, deep inversion, and we're now up to negative 49 basis points. We're up 4 basis points today. Most pros will tell you disinversion brings instability, and that's what we see in the market.
The surprise for me, Tom, is how it's happened. If we sat around this table around spring and said, okay, disinversion, curve steepness, where's it going to come from? The jargon you would have heard, Lisa, is bull steepener. We would have heard the front end's going to rally because the Fed's going to start cutting interest rates, and you'll see that. That's not what's happening here. It's the long end selling off. It's the 10-year, it's the 30-year. And if you want to draw a line back to what's happening here, I can't point to the data. The data's been decent, but you haven't seen massive changes there. Can you really say we've had a change in tone from the Federal Reserve? I don't think I'd go that far. I think you have to go back to the Treasury refunding announcement later in the summer, which really sparked that drama at the long end. Now, whether you believe that should be driving this kind of price action, just to join the dots here, Bramo, that's where they go.
I will add to that the idea of quantitative tightening, where you've seen $1 trillion run off the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve over the past year or so. So you can see that coming to the fore. Steve Risciuto put it really well yesterday. He said, since the Fed's statement, this market is losing faith that this Fed has the conviction to inflict the kind of pain necessary to bring inflation down to 2%. And every upside surprise just adds steam to that. And so basically what you're seeing is not a term premium. It is an inflation premium that is getting built in to the bond market.
Sonal Desai, Franklin Templeton, a little bit later this morning. Look out for that conversation. She has thoughts similar to the kind of thoughts that Lisa just lay out. I want to finish on foreign exchange. Dollar, strongest of the year so far. The euro briefly, 104. Dollar yen getting closer. And closer to 150 and backing away. You can flip it around this morning. The dollar's a little weaker after all the strength we've seen, but TK, what a move we've seen in the dollar over the last couple of months.
And the pro nuance here is euro weaker, yen stable. It's been weaker yen the last couple of days. Every day, folks, there's some nuance here as the pros triangulate. In the last 24 hours, it's about that euro weaker.
106 on DXY. Under surveillance this morning. Oil stockpiles at major U.S. storage hubs dropping to critical levels, pushing the price closer to $100 a barrel. Inventories at a hub in Oklahoma falling just below 22 million barrels, the lowest mark since July of last year, and close to operational minimums. This is what Amrita Sen yesterday was talking about, Lisa. The tension in supply, in inventories, really breathing some life into this rally.
I wanted to actually go exactly to that interview with Amrita Sen. She also said that people are underestimating potentially how inelastic prices are. I thought that was a fascinating point, that because of the lack of supplies and because of the fact that people are going back to the office, that things are coming from a low base of necessary travel, you're going to see prices stay higher for longer before that demand destruction comes into play. We are hearing that on the edges from others as well. So at what point does that become a real feature for the Fed, for other central banks, for inflation expectations?
I wouldn't go that micro. The Pacific Rim is going back to the office post-COVID. That's
China.
how I'd put it. Yeah. Well, Indonesia, pick your country.
Amrita made that point as well. More on that a little bit later. Government shutdown. We've got to go there, unfortunately. A last-minute deal to avoid a government shutdown looking unlikely as lawmakers struggle to find common ground ahead of Sunday's deadline. A bipartisan stopgap measure agreed to in the Senate still has to make its way through the Republican-controlled House, where Speaker Kevin McCarthy could be ousted if he takes it to a vote. Lisa, what on earth is happening?
Why does Kevin McCarthy want this job? I'm serious. What power does he have?
People asked that question when he was facing those votes at the time.
Well, I'm still going to ask it because right now people are saying he's got zero leverage negotiating with the president because he doesn't have the whole party behind him. What power does he have to act as a leader at a time where he cannot bring everybody together and he doesn't necessarily have the ability to face off with Democratic leadership because of that? And I don't know how this is going to end without something that really forces his hand.
I'm going to defer to AMH. Anne-Marie's going to answer that question in the next hour. If you're listening, Anne-Marie, yes, you are. Final story for you. Former President Donald Trump skipping last night's GOP debate, instead speaking to auto workers in the battleground state of Michigan. Trump attacking the Biden administration's push for EVs, saying it will lead to the, quote, assassination of the automobile industry and see jobs Tom lost to China.
Yeah, and I would also point out, particularly for an international audience, he had a very difficult day in selected courts in New York City. I don't pretend to be expert on it, but clearly what the pros are saying of the myriad cases he has, yesterday was a difficult day for him and his family as well.
China really, Tom, on the EV battlefront, big deal.
Yeah.
Big deal.
I agree, and we learned that in London. I learned a lot in London, advanced on EVs from us about this China.
Well, particularly for the EU, and we've been following that story, the inability to compete directly with some of these Chinese manufacturers and the push that you're seeing from Ursula von der Leyen, potentially, Lisa, to increase tariffs.
So here's my question, and then what you also saw from Rishi Sunak, the idea of backpedaling on some of the targets of when you get to certain EV adoption. How difficult is it for some of these auto manufacturings to maneuver with policy that changes day to day, depending on what the political winds are? And at what point is consistency the most important thing, which is not attainable at a time of such divergent political winds as well as just economic ones?
One of the important things about our guests, and we treasure what we call our best guests like Ian Shepherdson and Pantheon Macroeconomics, is we follow them where they go. We were going to do a remote, John was going to do a remote with Ian Shepherdson last night from the East Stands, overlooking Milburn Stand, and off to the left, Gallows Gate Stand at Newcastle, where Newcastle trounced Man City, I say. Not an upset, but a giant win for the brethren of the eastern shore of the United Kingdom. And they had possession, John, 32% of the time, and they still beat Man City. We go to a gentleman who knows the tots, knows English football, John Farrow, to speak with Ian Shepherdson.
Ian Shepherdson, this is why you're here. This was the appearance fee. We're going to mention Newcastle United. You're in the stadium. How great was that atmosphere, Ian?
It was marvellous. Well, only in the second half. The first half was very tense and frankly a bit dull, but the second half was absolutely glorious.
That's it. Now we need to get to business. Let's talk about this bond market. Ian, we've talked a million times about the slowdown that's just around the corner, the US consumer that's about to break. Ian, then I look at jobless claims, around 200K, unemployment still south of 4%. Ian, where is it?
Well, it's not in those data yet, and if we get a government shutdown, we won't see what's in those data at all next week because a payroll report won't appear. But looking at some of the real-time stuff, there's been a couple of really interesting developments just over the last 8 weeks or so. So there's been an enormous surge already in student loan payments, which legally don't have to start till October, but people have started paying them much earlier than that. And already we've seen a big drop-off in things like restaurant demand, airline travel growth, hotel occupancy rates. Auto sales, looks like we're going to see the first quarterly decline in auto sales for over a year in Q3. None of this stuff is a coincidence. It's 40 million people have got to find $300 a week now to make their loan repayments, which they didn't have to make in the summer when the consumption numbers June, July were looking pretty great. So I just wonder whether there's a turning point happening now, which isn't visible yet in some of the official hard data, but is visible in some of the real-time stuff. And if that's the case, then Q4 is going to be very interesting. You've got the strike, the UAW strike, you've got the shutdown, the student loan chaos. It's very messy.
To the tumult right now, Ian Shepherdson, and this goes to the Pantheon commitment to China analysis, you make clear we underestimate the industrial August jump in China. Frame out a surprise jump in China's economy.
Yeah, well, a jump might be pushing it a bit, but the industrial profits numbers are certainly appear to have turned around kind of across the board with better revenue numbers and better pricing numbers. And so I would describe manufacturing as certainly putting in kind of a solid floor there. And that's not just a China story. We're seeing that in some of the data outside China as well. The US industrial numbers have stabilized. I wouldn't yet say that there's a meaningful recovery in there, but there's certainly a degree of stability. So, you know, China, although China's economy is disappointing, let's be clear, they're growing. I mean, they're probably going to grow 4% or so this year, not the 5% that they want, but they're not going to be a million miles away from it. And a key part of that is this stabilization in the industrial sector and a rebound in profits. So the news isn't all terrible. I mean, a lot of attention on Evergrande and Country Garden, and that is terrible. And that's got a long way to go. But at least on the industrial side, which is a huge part of their economy, a much bigger part of their economy than it is of the US or Europe. But looks like some element of stability is creeping in there now.
Let's bring the news to 8:30 this morning. It's 2 hours from now. Ian Shepherdson, there's GDP. Some of us flunk macro when we go to GDI, which is another way to calculate the spirit of the American economy. Many are looking for a markdown in GDP. Are you?
I think there might be a little one, but I'm more expecting a big upgrade to the GDI, the income numbers. There's a lot of changes. So what's happening in today's report is the once every 5-year comprehensive revisions to the whole national account. So there's a huge ton of changes. It'll take a long time to sift through everything. But the biggest single change that they're going to make, it looks to me anyway, is to start including interest payments from the Fed as a part of private sector income to financial institutions. And because those interest payments have soared over the last few quarters with the Fed raising rates so much, that's kind of been so far uncounted income to the private sector, which may be why the GDI numbers have been so weak relative to GDP. Now, that gap has prompted a lot of people to get very excited, arguing the economy is much weaker than it looks, but actually, I think it's probably going to be resolved in the other direction, with the GDI coming up and the GDP not doing very much. At least I hope so. I mean, they're making dozens of other changes, and they could all offset each other. It's a real wild card. But, if the economy really were as weak as the GDI numbers, we wouldn't be seeing jobless claims at 200, 220. We wouldn't be seeing 200,000 a month payrolls, and we probably wouldn't have 3.5 unemployment. So I kind of think the story of hidden weakness is probably wrong.
Well, if that's the case, then what makes you think that fourth quarter is going to really be a quarter of weakness?
Well, the fourth quarter's got these weird things. It's got the strike, it's got the shutdown, it's got the start of student loan payments, which is these things are all one-time things, but they can make a meaningful difference. The student loan story in particular, this is 40 million adults suddenly having to divert $300 a month from spending at restaurants and travel and other fun things into making loan repayments, which they haven't had to do since the start of the pandemic. So it's a one-time thing, but it's an adjustment that'll take a few months to play through entirely. And also, you've got to remember here that we're hitting now the lagged effect of the more rapid tightening that the Fed did in the summer and the fall of 22. So it takes a long time for the Fed's actions to work through. Markets are very impatient. Everyone's very impatient. I normally work, rule of thumb, 6 quarters from a Fed rate hike to see the full effect on growth. So all we've seen so far is the impact of that initial tightening. It was 6 quarters ago when they started raising rates. There's a lot more to come, and that's what's making me nervous about next year. So, the markets have been focused on the upside surprises to growth in the summer of this year, and markets still aren't convinced about disinflation in the US. You were talking earlier about that. But I think that those stories both change next year. I'm expecting a kind of a weak growth environment and sustained disinflation. And in that background, a 4.60 10-year note just doesn't really make any sense.
I've got about 30 seconds. I want to go there, though. When you say things like that, we haven't seen it yet. Where haven't we seen it, where you expect to see it in the next 6 months?
Well, we've seen the start of it. The inflation numbers that Powell has talked about, 2 or 3 good months isn't enough. And that's true, fair enough. But my guess is that in 6 months' time, we'll be looking back
just
at
to jump
8 or 9
in,
months
because I'm really against the clock, so forgive me.
Point,
but a lot of people might say that all we've seen so far is inflation come down because the supply side has improved. Where do you expect to see actual Fed hikes start to come through the economy to bring down demand? What spot in the economy?
Yeah. Well, wage growth is slowing now. The ECI is rolling over. The quits rate's back to where it was before the pandemic began. The labour market is rebalancing. It's normalising. That drives the core services inflation. That's what the Fed cares about.
OK. Ian, thank you, sir, for the update. Congratulations on the win as well. Ian Shepperson of Pantheon Macroeconomics. Coming up next, have you heard about the iPhone 15 getting too hot?
Oh, yeah.
Heats up too much. Too hot to handle, Dan Ives of Wedbush might say. Dan Ives joining us next on set in New York. This is Bloomberg.
The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, these companies need to obey European regulations. That's not surprising. But often these companies choose that they will extend the European standards across their global conduct and their global production because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So there are benefits to standardization, benefits to uniform production. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. And it is then the market forces and the business incentives of global companies that transform that EU rule.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
There are so many factors at play today.
It remains tight in certain parts of the economy.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Crisis is too strong a word.